There was probably maybe 50 to 75 people, and they were yelling and screaming, genocide, genocide, genocide. Our 10-year-old was home at the time. And I live in a building where I was able to get up on the roof, and I was kind of listening to it. And I was waiting until it really got it ugly and whatever. And then I just held up the Israeli flag. And to me, I don't know why that's controversial to just be like, hey, it's just the Israeli flag. But that, some people might have saw that as provocative or aggression. It's like, no, that's just saying you've made your statement. You have these kinds of things. That's my statement. I'm like, hey, I'm here for standing with Israel. I don't know why I don't show up at your house, with flags and start yelling and accusing you of things.
Do you remember where you were as you were learning about the catastrophe of October 7th?
Yeah, no.
What was going on? I
started getting these calls and hearing all like this violence and the depravity and the things that were emerging from it. And I mean, if anyone's that's seen that video
you mean the 47-minute video? Yeah. Have you seen it?
Oh, yeah. No, of course. And other things that were at the time might have been considered classified at the time. But my point, and the fact that they filmed this and some of the transcriptions where, some of those intercepted kinds of conversations, and they're cheering it, and like they're calling up like their family, like, hey, look, we just killed 3 Jews or whatever. And what they've done, and just the kinds of, just the barbarism and the cruelty. And that was not just, that wasn't terrorism. That was really, for me, I described that as a war on civilization. And that really kind of just shifted immediately for me. And that's like, hey, I'm going to be a committed voice for Israel and the Jewish community. Because after that, things aren't ever going to be the same. And for the largest kinds of an attack, and how personal and vicious and that was since the Holocaust. For me, it's like, what if they did that to my family? Like if you had people barging into my home and raped my daughter and my wife and shot them in their heads or tortured it, or they made my children watch these kinds, like the kinds of, like, where does that come from? Where does that kinds of evil and depravity come from? And it's like, what if that was me? And I'm like, I would never negotiate with that kinds of evil, and I would never want that for anyone else. And now at that point, you can never allow that kinds of a force and that kinds of evil survive. And absolutely, I made that statement, like, whatever they need, military, financial, or intelligent wise, like, I'm always going to support that and vote for those things.
Okay, but that position that you just articulated just now, meaning your reaction was unconditional support for Israel?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Right. Yeah, unconditional. Yeah.
But that position was not shared by some, not all, but some in your Democratic Party. And there was this progressive group, the squad, whatever you want to call them, who indeed—
so some people almost immediately, within the first couple of weeks. Well, and also let me just speak to that. I mean, I got my graduate degree at Harvard, and then immediately, like the shocking, it was like the day after, the place just like you had about 30 different groups, and they had this letter, and essentially it's like, well, Israel deserved this and that thing. Like, wow, that's crazy, that kind of response. I'm like, oh my God. And some people in my party were calling for a ceasefire and all that stuff. I'm like, after what? After what? That's outrageous. I'm like, no, of course not. Of course not. And then for me, I committed to, like, I'm willing to be like the last man standing in my party that's ever going to be with no conditions till the end, until Hamas is effectively neutralized. It was pretty kind of clear that the Democratic Party felt like they had to criticize or react in that. And for me, I guess some people decided, like, let's go after Netanyahu or the leader. And I'm like, absolutely, I'm never going to sign on for that. This is the Democratic leader of our ally. And now if you're going to criticize or go after any side, it should be against Hamas. And, whether you might think someone is a bad person or a terrible leader, whatever that is, well, he is the leader that Israel decided on, and that's our ally. And when you consider what the alternative is in the war, and I'm like, there's absolutely I'm ever going to go attack the democratic leader of our ally in the middle of an existential war.
You were very outspoken. There was a vote. I can't remember the exact date, but there was a vote on funding, with continued funding for various parts of Israel's defenses, the funding for Iron Dome.
Yeah, well, Iron Dome. Like we actually members of my party voting against Iron Dome and those things like that whole BDS and the Iron Dome and all those kinds of voting. I'm like, what is wrong with you? These are defensive and going after that. It's like, and that was like that emerging paradox where the people of the most progressive elements of my party, the only nation in that region that are projecting and those are the kinds of values. That's Israel. And it's like such a paradox. That's the kind of places that have the values that you espouse and you live in our nation.
Were you ever pressured by leaders of the Democratic Party to just quiet down? You were very outspoken early on. I remember seeing you at the big demonstration on the mall a month or so after October 7th, where you were standing there with the Israeli flag wrapped around you. It was quite moving, I must say. Hundreds of thousands of people, mostly Jews, and there you were standing there with the Israeli flag, very outspoken, very critical of critics of Israel, including critical of democratic critics of Israel. Did anyone ever tell you, hey, Senator, pipe down?
Not expressly sitting down and say, but I've had protesters start showing up immediately at my office and then inevitably at my home. And I've said, look, I'm sorry. I realize I'm going to be an outlier and I refuse to pander to that. I understand there's an election happening and they try to run between the raindrops and try to have it both ways. I'm like, I'm never going to pander to that Dearborn kinds of audience. And if you are willing to vote for the other side, well, you're probably not going to enjoy that outcome. And then turns out that happened. So for me, it's not about the election; it's about what's the right side, and I'm going to follow Israel through that. And I have disagreed publicly, even the president at that time. I never supported this idea of holding back on the largest munitions of the 2,000-pound bombs and those things. It's like whatever they need to eradicate Hamas. And people forget, or they try to ignore, that this is, and the misery and the civilian death was designed by Hamas. They've embedded themselves and they hide in the schools or the hospitals. And I will never forget, and this was shortly after at that hospital, and they claimed that a rocket hit, and they all announced that 500 people were killed, and that was an Israeli rocket, and Israel intercepted the radio where it was one of their own rockets. And I'm like, there's no way that was going to kill 500 people. That's impossible.
Meaning it was the Palestinian Islamic Jihad's rockets.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
That's the point. And it's like people started attacking Israel, and they said that is not us. That was them. It's 1,000 people. Metaphorically reacted, but only one just was like, by the way, that wasn't true. And that was part of the recurring things, that there was going to be a famine, and they have cheapened words in our language. One of them is genocide. Genocide, describing that Israel was engaging in genocide. I'm like, that is factually, it's not true. But if you really are engaging in a genocide, why are you telling people you got to evacuate? Here's where I'm going to strike. How many societies that are engaging in a genocide are facilitating vaccination programs for their children? Israel was forced to conduct a war through these civilians, and also had to make sure that they got the kinds of food and other kinds of support through this, through constant criticism for what they've done and thing that happened. Just whatever you describe that as blood libel, whatever, just the kinds of lies that just got repeated in the media, and it's just not true. And I've said this publicly. You are working against people peace and teaching Hamas, knowing that, hey, this kinds of messaging on social media has, and they use those kinds of words like colonizing or this, well, there must be an oppressor and there must be the oppressed, and created those really kinds of false constructs.
You're saying all these things, and you were saying these things as events were unfolding. There were leaders of your own party that were pressuring you. You even had members of your own Senate staff who, according to public reports, resigned over the position you had taken. At any point, I'm just trying to get a sense, because at some point, does it start to hurt? Like, these are people who are working for you. These are people who signed up to work for you, and they felt so strongly that you were like way out there on this issue. By the way, most Americans probably don't think you're way out there. They think your position is very reasonable. But I'm just saying, did at some point any of this give you pause?
Well, for me, it came from a very simple, commitment. It's like Israel and the Jewish community deserves at least one consistent voice through this, at least from the Democratic Party. But people forget that the Jewish community is largely a Democratic, part of our base. And now, how can you have that party turn their back? But especially from the moral clarity, for me, when people ask me that question, I'm like, for me, it was always easy because it's always been that moral clarity. Like, can you just imagine if Israel was pushed into a ceasefire in last May or June, and can you imagine if people like Senor and Hamas would still be largely functional? And Hezbollah was described, all the so-called experts described that as like they were kind of like the ultimate badass. Think of the things that they did, and it was magnificent that Israel finally called bullshit on those kinds of organizations, and then after the beepers, and I'm like, I respond by saying, I'm like, oh, I love it. People would say, are you sure, really? Like, whatever. I'm like, oh yeah, I love it 100%. Because for me, that's the ultimate micro-targeting. Like if you want to criticize Israel having to use those kinds of large munitions, the only people that have beepers, well, they're terrorists. And the ones that it's like, if you have a beeper and that goes boom and you get taken out, that is, in my description, that's the most effective way to get in their head, and also to neutralize some of their people in ways to minimize all the collateral damage as well too. And now Hezbollah was exposed as really kind of largely a paper tiger, and I fully support. I also loved for them systematically eliminating the leadership.
Can you talk in January of 24? You had pressure all this time from October to through now. You get pressure from the Democratic Party. You have staff members that resign because of your positions on this issue. And in January of 24, you had this protest. They showed up at your home.
Oh yeah,
right in Braddock. And can you describe that scene and how you responded?
Yeah, well, they could see it online, and there was probably maybe 50 to 75 people, and they were yelling and screaming, genocide, genocide, genocide. Our 10-year-old was home at the time, and I live in a building where I was able to get up on the roof, and I was kind of listening to it. And I was waiting until it really got it ugly and whatever. And then I just held up the Israeli flag. And to me, I don't know why that's controversial to just be like, hey, it's just the Israeli flag. But that, some people might have saw that as provocative or aggression. It's like, no, that's just saying you've made your statement. You have these kinds of things. That's my statement. I'm like, hey, I'm here for standing with Israel. I don't know why I don't show up at your house, with flags and start yelling and accusing you of things. But you have done that. You've made your statement. I'm making mine. And that's part of that ongoing dialogue where I'm like, look, the death of innocent Palestinians and children, I mean, that's absolutely a tragedy. But I think perhaps the difference between you and I is that you might blame those things on Israel, but for me, I blame Hamas and I blame Iran. And that's kind of like a fundamental difference where, like, why can you deny the responsibility with the people that are doing these terrible things and the kind of nations that are financing all of it?
Do you ever try to just explain to, I mean, I don't know how much you can actually have a dialogue with these protesters, but colleagues of yours, friends on the left.
It's hard to because it's immediately like it's yelling and, and they show up and then there's always like the phone, like they start filming it and they tried everything to get on like these silly videos to go viral just for video online.
But many of these activists claim to support women's rights, gay rights, freedom of religion. If you actually want to be on the side of these liberal values, you should be for Israel.
I agree. Like we've all seen those signs where it's like queers for Palestine. Like, can you just imagine? Yeah, I agree. It's almost like something out of like a Portlandia, that show, like kind of a thing. And it's like if you are a member of that community and you show up in Gaza or in some of those nations, they're going to give you a choice. It's like you can pick the building that we're going to throw you on the top of. And then after I visited Israel, you could witness it that people that were gay, they could walk around and they could be free and just hold hands and they could be affectionate with members of the same sex. It's like that's where the values that you claim to really live by, and it's like that's where it's actually in Israel. And that's what's part of why I think Israel is miraculous. In the middle of all of it, they produced the kind of a society that has the values that people, especially of the Democratic Party, would, we believe we would define that as the most kind of important things.
Many have looked at you since the election of 2024 as potentially a model for how Democrats could reemerge and appeal to the center of the political spectrum.
There's some things that I think transcends party. And for me, a situation like what happened after 10/7, anyone that has studied history, if you happen again and again and again, nations and organizations attack Israel, they lose. And then they lose more freedom. They lose lower quality of their lives and more land. And it's like, just when can you decide and understand, stop attacking Israel and build your own nation rather than trying to destroy theirs? And now I've done events in that election you referenced with Bill Clinton. And now remember what they were offered.
Meaning what they were offered in 2000 when President Clinton was president and the Israeli government and the leader of the Palestinians, Yasser Arafat, went to Camp David and they were offered a Palestinian state.
96%. And you can pick which 4%. You get the capital of East Jerusalem and all this. And they're like, no. And now it's like, you have a pension if you end up in prison or killed while we were arrested or killed, killing Jews and creating that kind of terror. And trying to pretend that this is not the same. This is not the same.
There are many people who, as I said, they look at you as potentially a model of how the Democrats could reemerge. And at the same time, the issues we're talking about today, right now, are treated as, quote unquote, a issue of concern to the Jewish community. And I think something you pointed out to me in a previous conversation we've had, where you said you'll take your position on Israel and you'll let your opponents and critics take their position on Israel. And you said, and let's both go debate it in the center of Scranton, Pennsylvania, which is, let's just say, not a big Jewish community. You'll go in the heart of Scranton, Pennsylvania. We'll stand in the middle and we'll debate and we'll see where regular voters from Scranton, Pennsylvania stand. Meaning, I think what you're saying is this is not just a Jewish community issue. This is a proxy for something much bigger.
I agree. It is. It's just kind of like, whose side are you on? People that rape and torture young girls and women, that tie families together and they set them on fire, and they filmed that terrible things. They are proud of those things. And the history when they don't want peace, if you look at their whole charter, the front and center, it's like we have to destroy Israel. The rampant anti-Semitism that flood the campuses too, saying things like, from the river to the sea thing. Everyone understands what that is. I mean, that's Hamas's jingle. And, and they say, well, no, that's about universal human rights or whatever. It's like, oh, that's bullshit. You and I know what that means. And it's like, at least have the character to stand by that kinds of eradicating of Israel. And that's kind of like the rot that I described in my party, and definitely in some of the elite kinds of institutions, not similar, just like the one I graduated from. And I did not recognize the campus that I graduated at that time, a quarter of a century ago. And I had Republican members of the faculty, even people like Mickey Edwards and Alan Simpson and David Gergen and all of them. And that wasn't controversial in that. But now I can't even imagine. One of the co-founder of the Heritage Foundation, we got to run that guy there out of our town with a rail and those things. And I can't imagine what kind of real dialogue's happening if you turn it into like a bubble. The whole the monoculture, and that really kind of fomented all of this intensely anti-Israel.
I want to talk about a couple of issues just before we wrap up that have been in the news that you have been an outspoken on or an outlier on. One of them is the effort in the Senate to sanction the International Criminal Court.
It turned out I was the only Democrat to vote.
You were the only Democrat to vote with the Republicans on that bill. Why did you think taking that position was so important? Because I'm sure you took a lot of heat for it. Because I'm like, hey, I'm going to follow Israel. It's like Israel fully understands the stakes, and that's about their own survival. And like when you have an organization that has equivocated the leaders of Hamas and the Democratic leader in a just war, that's repugnant. And now even IDF soldiers have to be concerned, are they going to get arrested in some of these member nations? It's absolutely, I reject that in the strongest way. And for me, we had the opportunity when we were in the majority to do it right. And they were unwilling to do that. I hope that it wasn't just the kind of pander or afraid of from an election. Well, so now we have the opportunity, and I'm going to vote for that. I'm going to sign on. And then I did that, and it was disappointing being the only member in my party. For me, that's right or wrong, and there isn't a lot of nuance when you are torturing and murdering innocent civilians. And the way and the kind of conditions, let's not ever forget that has happened and why we've arrived at this place right now. So there was a resolution addressing the two-state solution. You were one of two Democrats to vote opposite the rest of your party on it. And then you've been supportive of some of the things President Trump has been saying about Gaza and what to do with Gaza going forward. So what's that about? I mean, what?
Yeah, no. I said that. It's like for me, that wasn't serious. That was just kind of like, if, for lack of a better term, that's almost kind of like a shock or a bluff to the system. Basically, it's daring them. It's like either you and these nations take responsibility. It's like you do your job, and you better figure out a better option, because nobody actually wants to own this. We just want them to just figure out on building their own nation and not stop attacking Israel, and we can all move on after that. So, and I think you've noticed after that kind of a shock, people now, all of these nations are meeting together and saying, well, hey, where's the better idea? Like, hey, I'm all about that. So like, I would never, ever support having American soldiers or that kinds of thing. I don't think anyone honestly wants to own Gaza. That's absurd. What actually is truly absurd is that these so-called experts have been absolutely wrong about the whole region throughout all these years and all this generation. And after what Israel pushed through, after all of the constant ceasefire and all that pressure, now look at that. Hamas was severely damaged and degraded, and then Hezbollah, begging for a ceasefire. And now in Iran sent their best, and now they essentially were now begging, kind of like, oh, no, please, no, how about that? So now you have an opportunity for the first who knows when, where there could be possible peace. And aren't they ever hold themselves accountable for being absolutely wrong about all of the underlying dynamics? And that's all been shattered and blown away. So for me, it was easy to follow Israel because they all understood. And I promise you that beepers and the walkie-talkies and that kinds of intelligence will be the kind of a triumph will be studied for the next 30 years. And now I might disagree with Joe Biden, and I am going to disagree with Donald Trump. But for me, it's because I'm following Israel, because they are going to have what's closest to their true alignment.
Just in wrapping up here, a friend of yours who we know in common said to me that you recently met with a group of October 7th orphans of the war. And he said, ask him about it. So I'm asking you about it. Can you tell me who you met with?
I have I have 3 children, but 2 sons. And before they arrived, I spoke to my son, and he just turned 16 and he just got his permit.
To drive.
Yeah, to drive. And the first orphan that I spoke to was 16 years old. And he described the circumstances, how his father saved people, and his father was killed. And I'm like, I talked to my son, a 16-year-old, and talked to a 16-year-old who he became an orphan, and all of these children were able to describe those terms. Like I don't know how they do it. And they were grateful for my support. I'm like, you guys are heroes. You guys inspire me. And I couldn't function if I had to witness or if I've lost my parents throughout all that barbarity. So it's like, that's the kind of thing that makes it easy. And now, yes, it costs, money, and I have dented my base, and I know I've lost some kind of democratic support in certain quarters, but for me, following the right side and that moral clarity, I think for me personally, what defines your character are the things that you're willing to do that might even move against your own political interests.
You in your office have posters hung up, photos of the hostages.
Yeah. Well, I've met with countless hostage families. Each one is an honor, and that started immediately right after. And his was a father, and his son was taken as a hostage, and he had that iconic poster. And I said, "Would you sign this up?" And we put it up. We put it up right outside my office, and then we were forced to move it inside. And then I was like, "Hey, they're all going to come up in my front room at my office." Because people have stopped talking about it, and it receded into the public conversation. Well, not here, it won't. And now, as they were released, or they were rescued, or they were murdered by Hamas, they were migrated from one side to the other, and it's closely monitored. And they're all going to stay up until everyone is brought home. And now look at today, what's happening, and they are terrorizing these hostages, and they are cheering when they are marching out with caskets of children that they've killed. And it's like, where does this sickness come from? And like, what kind of a society puts up the kinds of organization that has normalized that kinds of depravity? And, where have you lost the humanity to cheering the death of children and marched out like if it was like a Mardi Gras parade?
Senator Fetterman, thank you for your courage, for your leadership, and for
it's not courage. It really isn't. What's courage is living and forced to live in a tunnel or in the dark for 500 days, or being a soldier and fighting for the survival of your nation. That's and being in those families, or they're living under the risk of rocket attacks. That's courage. Being a senator, that's small compared to that. I never expected if that voice would penetrate, but if it did, I'm just grateful to proudly stand with that community, witnessing at a very, very hyper local way, like after the Tree of Life. But now, if people have sought out after my voice like that's an incredible honor. But for me, that's been easy.
Well, then I'll thank you for your clarity. How about that? Thank you for your clarity, and thank you for your time today. And hope to have you back on and continue this conversation.
Oh, well, I do hope if that happens, and I do look forward to it, that there's even more and more better outcomes right now. And we don't have no more cheering over caskets or terrorizing a poor woman in the middle of a crowd. But what one won't change if I am back on next is my vote and voice is not going to change if I see you and speak again.
Thank you.